Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Aquarium's Online Academy. My name's Luke. I'm here from the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California. And I hope everyone's having a great day wherever you might be joining us from. We're going to be talking this morning about some very, very, very interesting and very, very oceany animals. They're so oceany, in fact, I don't think you can find anywhere except the ocean. We're going to be talking about jellies. And more generally, we're also going to be talking a lot about the big group of organisms that jellies oftentimes get lumped into, the group of organisms that we refer to as plankton. Plankton is one of those words that we all hear probably a lot when we hear, about the ocean and when we watch movies about the ocean and stuff like that. But the funny thing is that it's a really confusing word because you'll hear somebody say, well, jellies are plankton. Oh, and also algae is plankton. Oh, and then this little teeny tiny animal here is plankton. And it makes you go, well, what is plankton then? What makes the thing plankton? So we're going to learn today what it is that makes an animal plankton, or a plant plankton, or any kind of living thing plankton. And then we're really going to take a deep dive into probably everyone's favorite plankton, and that is, of course, the jellyfish, or sea jellies, as we prefer to call them here at the aquarium, since after all, they're not really fish, which we'll get to as well. Now, if you have questions throughout the show, you can text them to us, and they'll be passed on to me to answer on the show. So the number to text is 562-286-1838. Again, that's 562-286-1838. And if you're watching later, you can also email us questions at live@lbaop.org. That one we'll check after the show's over. If you have any bigger questions or something you want to ask, feel free to text us or to email us anytime there. But if you want to get your questions answered live, just text us at the number right below me, which will be shown throughout the show. Now, plankton. What is a plankton? What does the word plankton really mean? Well, think for a moment of some things that are plankton. I'll give you some examples. For one thing, a piece of algae floating in the water, a tiny little piece of algae that floats along the ocean, counts as plankton. Also, a teeny little baby crab that's maybe just hatched from its egg and is floating along in the water counts as plankton. A jellyfish that can barely control where it goes, mostly just kind of floats around and pumps its bell to catch food, just floats along in the water, is also a kind of plankton. In fact, there's a lot of animals in the ocean that start their lives as plankton but don't necessarily stay that way forever. So I'm just making this more and more confusing, right? That's because the word plankton isn't used for a specific kind or group of animals, but rather it's a word we use for any kind of organism in the water that just floats around. So it can cover a lot of stuff. Because believe it or not, a huge amount of life in the ocean, most of it really, doesn't have that much control over where it goes. It just gets carried around by the ocean's currents. Now, some of these organisms that we call plankton might be able to control where they go a little bit, like a jelly can control a little bit about how deep it is and stuff like that. But they can't say, if the current suddenly starts moving real quickly in one direction, a planktonic organism like a jelly or like a little tiny hatchling of a crab or even sometimes a baby fish can't control where they go. They just get carried along by the current. And because of that, because they just basically have to float and trust the current, we call them plankton. There's actually another word that people almost never use for organisms in the ocean that don't have this problem. Animals like dolphins and whales and stuff that actually can decide where they go at any time, can just swim wherever they want. We actually call them nekton. But you almost never hear anybody say that one. People just talk about plankton all the time and never use the word nekton for anything. But there is actually a word for it. So plankton, again, it can be an animal, it can be an algae, it can be a bacteria, it can be a virus. Plankton can be any kind of living organism in the ocean. The only requirement is that it basically just floats around. So a lot of animals in the ocean are plankton at one point in their lives, but not necessarily the whole time. In fact, all the animals in this picture, or most of them probably, would have started their lives as plankton. Because if you take a look at these sea stars, we have several different kinds of sea stars here. Sea stars, when they're adults, right, or when they're big and strong enough, spend their life holding on to rocks and moving along the ocean bottom, looking for things like clams and stuff to eat. But when they're babies, they actually float freely. The mom and dad sea stars shoot all their eggs and sperm up into the water. They mix in the water. The eggs get fertilized, and the little larvae just float around for quite a while, trying to catch even tinier plankton so that they can grow big enough to eventually get strong enough to be able to live on a rock. A lot of anemones start their lives this way too. They do the same kind of thing where they release their eggs into the water. It's called broadcast spawning. A lot of animals in the ocean start their lives that way. You heard me mention baby crabs earlier. Crabs oftentimes do this. Lobsters oftentimes do this. There's lots of fish that do this. So many, many animals in the ocean start their lives as plankton, and then eventually, as they get older, turn into a nekton, turn into an animal that can control where it goes. Now, we're already starting to get some questions. And since I did say that today our biggest plankton focus is going to be jellies, I'm going to move on to them now, because when we talk about plankton, rather than think just about the ones that are plankton only when they're babies, some of the most interesting animals are the ones that have figured out how to be plankton for their whole lives. And there are plenty of organisms out there that can do that, and jellies are by far the most famous example. So I already got my first question of the day. The question was from Mrs. Sanchez's class. It was, do jellies eat? Well, this is a good question. Well, they're an animal, right? So animals always have to eat. So we can guess that, yeah, they probably do, right? But how? How do you think a jelly could eat? If you take a look at these jellies, these are moon jellies here, by the way. These are the ones you can actually touch when you visit the aquarium. They have to be able to eat so they can grow and get bigger. How do you think they do it? I bet a lot of you out there are already guessing at the right answer. Maybe you already know or figured it out. These tentacles are step one in that process of allowing them to eat. So jellies are just floating around, right? But they don't float completely randomly. As they move around, they do have a few basic senses that allow them to kind of have a rough idea of kind of how deep they are in the water, whether it's daytime or nighttime, stuff like that. And what they try to do as they pump their bells along, which these moon jellies aren't really doing here, is they try to put themselves in places where there's likely to be food. And we'll look at our sea nettles. This is actually a live camera from inside the aquarium. You can watch this any time of day you want to. I believe these are West Coast sea nettles, a really big and spectacular kind of jelly. I saw one of these not too long ago. I actually ruined my cell phone just like a few weeks ago because I tried to take an underwater video of a sea nettle. I guess it wasn't as waterproof as I thought. So anyway, these sea nettles are demonstrating really well what it is that jellies can do, and that is pump their bell to move. So as they move through the water, as I mentioned, they can sense basic things like how deep they are, or whether they're pointed upside, whether they're up, right side up or upside down. They have special sensors along the edge of their bell that allows them to do that. And they have an inclination, a sort of instinctive sort of desire, even though they don't have brains, to rotate themselves in a way that's going to kind of push them toward things that are areas and places that are likely to have food. And once they get into these places that are likely to have food, for most jellies it might be, say, near the ocean surface during the day, because they may be feeding a lot of phytoplankton, which are what we call algae and plant plankton. They go along and they basically just pump along, and as they do, all sorts of stuff, all sorts of tiny organisms get caught on their tentacles. And why do things get caught on their tentacles? Well, it's the most famous thing about jellies of all, right? Because jellies have stingers. Every one of the tentacles of these sea nettles here is lined with thousands, maybe even millions, of teeny tiny little stingers. They're so small you can't see them. They're microscopic, but they are stingers. And the way they work is pretty simple, really. It's basically underneath the skin. If this is a jelly's skin, my arm here, underneath the skin of the jelly, there's this little coiled up spring thing. And there's thousands of these things. They're called cnidocytes or nematocysts. And there's a little trigger that sticks up out of the skin of the jelly. And when something bumps in to that trigger that sticks up out of the jelly's skin, whether it's a tiny plankton, whether it's a fish, whether it's me, that trigger gets pushed down and it unhooks a spring that then turns the whole cell underneath the skin inside out and shoots this spiked barb up into whatever just touched it. This happens super fast. This happens like the speed of sound. And when thousands of these things go off into the skin of an animal at once, they can stick to the animal and oftentimes have a venom associated with them that can be really, really unpleasant for the animal. It might even make them, might even kind of paralyze them temporarily or trap them. In the case of sea nettles, their sting is just not fun, but it's not gonna really hurt you, but it's not fun at all. It's very itchy and burny. I've been lucky enough never to have gotten stung myself, but sometimes the folks who take care of our sea jellies do, and they tell me that their sting usually wears off in a few hours. So at least that's good news. But if you're a small fish or something, and you get caught in a big jelly like this, you actually can potentially get eaten. So what happens once the jelly catches that food item? Then it's got it tangled up in these tentacles, right? And then it just proceeds on with this pumping action. But as it does all this, as it's pumping along, there's all sorts of stuff that's happening that's so small that you can't really see it, that gradually takes food from those stinging tentacles, moves it onto these kind of bushy-looking arms here, kind of fluffy ones. Those are called oral arms. And why are they called oral arms? Well, what does oral mean, right? Oral means having to do with the mouth, right? So these oral arms are basically the mouth arms of a jelly. So as the food gets moved onto those oral arms, it gradually gets moved on up and eventually comes into the bell. And the bell is where the digestive system of the jelly is located. And if you look at a jelly, you can't really see its digestive system unless there's food in it. You can only really kind of see the food that's being digested. And these guys, they're so colorful you can't really see it at all. But if we go back to the moon jellies, we can see it, though. Let's see if we can go back to those moon jellies. So you see those rings in the middle? The area around those rings is where their food gets digested. And if they have a lot of food, sometimes you can even see the color of it. Now, it's a little confusing, though, because that area where those rings are is also where their reproductive system is. So sometimes if the jellies are carrying reproductive cells with them, then sometimes you'll see that as well. And you can see as you watch these guys, like they have little pieces of stuff stuck to them and so on. There's even you can even maybe see, I don't know if this is showing up at home, but there's little pieces of little motes and stuff floating around the water. That's some of the plankton that we feed them. And they just eat this stuff. Now, I'm starting to get some more questions, which is fantastic. So this is a question from Mrs. Sanchez's class. I think I answered another one of your questions, too. And the question is, why do jellies shock? That's a good question, and we get this one a lot. Because jellies do sting, and and there are also animals, there's a few animals out there, like electric eels and electric rays, that actually can shock their prey as well. There's also some electric fish that aren't eels or rays, too. But they're actually two different things. The animals that shock their prey use basically a biological battery they have inside their body to create electricity. And those are, again, things like electric eels are the most famous example of an animal that can do that. Jellies do not shock you, they sting you. So rather than using electricity, they're using those barbs that shoot up out of their skin that I mentioned a few minutes ago. They're very, very tiny, they're very small, but they still work. And then a venom that's on those. So basically it's a kind of a poison that they're using to inject into the skin of anything that bumps into them. And because of this, we call it a venom instead of just a poison. So they don't shock us, actually. They sting us. And they envenom us and stuff when we bump into them. And there are jellies in the world that can sting really, really, really bad. Luckily, for those of us here, if you're joining us from nearby in California, luckily on the California coast there aren't too many horrible jellies. But there are some places where you have to be a little more careful. And whenever you go out swimming, if you're going to go to your local ocean, educate yourself a little bit about what kinds of jellies you might encounter. One of the great things about beaches with waves and stuff is that they're not great jelly habitat because waves kind of rip jellies up. They don't survive too long at beaches. So you don't have to worry about it so much when you're at a nice beach with some waves. But nonetheless, it's a good thing to keep in mind, especially if you go someplace tropical. Now, Mrs. Darrington's class asked another really good question. Why are jellies transparent? Ooh, this is a good one. So, as you've already probably seen, not every jelly is transparent. There are jellies that aren't transparent. The sea nettles we were just looking at are kind of translucent, I guess you'd say. They're not very transparent. But there are a lot of jellies that are basically see-through. And this is an amazing adaptation they've got. Remember, adaptations, right, are those things that help living things to survive. Things about their body or things that they're able to do that help them to stay alive. And if you're a jelly, there's a few things you need to do, right, in order to exist, right? You need to be able to catch your food and digest it. You need to be able to reproduce. And while you're doing this, you want to make sure that nothing eats you. Yeah, right? I mean, that's the other big thing for a living organism, out in nature, right? You want to make sure you don't get eaten or do your best not to get eaten. So jellies don't have a lot of natural defenses. I mentioned they have those stingers, right? So there's plenty of animals that wouldn't even want to bother eating a jelly and don't want to trouble with jellies at all because they don't want to get stung. But there's also animals that have skin and mouths and throats that are thick and strong enough that they are actually able to eat jellies anyway, even if they can sting. And a great example of this is this animal right here. This is a sea turtle, right? So sea turtles, lots of sea turtles actually, have the ability to eat jellies. And there's other animals that can eat jellies as well. There's birds that can do it. What are some other jelly predators off the top of our heads here? Let me ask. Some mollusks can do it. Oh yeah, mola molas, of course. This is the ocean sunfish, big giant thing. And so they have these predators, right, that are able to eat some of them. So that transparency makes them harder to see. The more see-through you are, the better you blend in with just about everything, right? So it's a very good question from Mrs. from Mrs. Darrington's class as to why they're transparent. Well, to make them harder to see. The harder you are to see, the less likely you are to get eaten by a sea turtle or a mola mola or anything else like that. Now, I've got another question. It's a follow-up to something I mentioned earlier. How do jellies know if it's daytime or nighttime? This is a question from Allie. Good question. How do jellies know if it's daytime or nighttime? I mentioned that they don't have brains, right? And it doesn't really look like they got much in the way of eyes either, does it? But jellies, even though they don't have brains, do have some basic senses. Along the edge of their bell, it's hard to see because they're kind of small and sometimes they kind of hide them with the way they shape their body, but there are these little dimples along the edge of a jelly's bell, right along kind of the lip of it here. And in those little dimples, there are various kinds of sense organs. Here you can see them better in the sea nettle here. You see all those little dimpled spots? Some of those sense organs tell the jelly whether it's right side up or upside down. They're called statoliths. And then there's also sense organs called eye spots or photophores that just tell the jelly how bright it is around them. And even though the jelly doesn't have a brain, and this is where it kind of gets hard to imagine, but this is how it works, each individual jelly species has basically been sort of tuned in a way to want to go towards certain kinds of things that are best for whatever that jelly species happens to be. So let's say you're a jelly like the sea nettle that generally likes to be kind of closer to the surface during the day, so you can catch plankton and stuff. When that jelly senses with all its little photosensors, all its little light sensors along the edge of its bell, that there is light around it, it stimulates it to orient itself toward that light and keep pumping up in that direction. And also those statoliths, those little teeny tiny sensors that allow it to know whether it's right side up or upside down, make it want to go up when it's daytime and down when it's darker. So these things allow jellies to actually do a little bit more moving and navigating than you'd think for a plankton, but they don't, but like I said, if there's a strong current, they still can't resist it. They get taken mostly wherever the ocean wants them to go. And I could see Mrs. C's class had a question about that as well. Do jellyfish have eyes? Again, not exactly. They have very, very simple light sensing organs, but they don't have eyes. They can't see colors or shapes, but they can tell whether it's daytime or nighttime. Mrs. De La O's class asked another good question. How long do jellies live? I love this one because it's complicated. All right, so look at these things, right? Take a look at jellies for a minute. They don't look like very sturdy creatures, do they? No, not really. I mean, like, seriously, like some jellies, you know, a fast-moving bubble can kill them. So, you know, it's not an animal that's very, very sturdy. And when we let people touch jellies here at the aquarium, we always have to be there watching to make sure that everyone's being super careful because it's very easy to hurt a jelly accidentally. So they're pretty delicate. And this is one of the main reasons why they don't tend to live that long. Jellies mostly have life cycles that are you know, range into the weeks and months. But here's the weird thing about it, though. Jellies, generally in nature, die because they got eaten by something, or because something damaged them, or they got a disease or something like that. Those are the kinds of things that end a jelly's life in nature. The crazy thing is that if those threats are not around, if, for example, they're living in a nice little aquarium where they just sort of go in a circle all day and get fed all the plankton they need, and oh, I'm being entangled, then they can actually live a lot longer because jellies, just like their cousins, the anemones and the corals, don't really age. They just sort of wear out. So for them, the limitation on their lifespan isn't like, you know, isn't really that predictable in the same sense that it is for a lot of other animals. They don't really age. You can't look at a jelly and be like, oh, that's a senior jelly, and that's a little, you know, this jelly's in the prime of life here. They don't get all wrinkled or anything like that. There's really no way to know when you look at a jelly exactly what its age is, and they don't really age. They don't die of old age. So jellies can actually live a pretty long time if they're well taken care of. But nonetheless, that means, though, that in the grand scheme of things, their lives are not super long. But like I said, it's complicated. Because where do jellies come from anyway? This is a question I haven't gotten to at all yet. Has anyone ever wondered where jellyfish come from? I mean, how do they come to exist? How do they come to exist? Jellies, actually, this is, oh, Stewie found a picture. This is fantastic. Jellies turn the whole plankton thing around a little bit. I mentioned how a lot of animals start their lives as plankton and then eventually aren't plankton anymore when they get bigger and stronger. A lot of fish and things like crabs and stuff start their lives as plankton. Urchins, sea stars, they float around when they're teeny little babies, but eventually they get strong enough that they don't float around anymore, so they're not plankton anymore, and then they live on a rock, or they can swim and decide where they go, or whatever, right? Jellies, it's kind of the other way around. Jellies, you could say, start their lives, oh, this is fantastic, this is a great video. Jellies start their lives stuck on a rock somewhere. Sort of. It's a life cycle, so it's kind of confusing. But basically, when mom and dad jellies reproduce, right, they eventually produce a little larva that settles onto a rock somewhere. And then it grows into these crazy looking things. Each individual little jelly baby, little jelly egg that lands on a rock and attaches, and this is an example of this on a little plate here at the aquarium. Each one that attaches catches passing plankton, kind of like an anemone does, where it just sits on the rock and catches things floating by, and gradually grows. As it grows, it eventually starts to clone itself. So your one little jelly baby then turns into this weird little baby jelly tower. This thing's called a strobila. And you can see them hanging down here. You see these weird stacks? Each one of those little rings is an individual jelly clone that all came out of the same jelly egg. So these things gradually grow, and you can see as they grow, they get a little bit more of a jelly-like shape. Sort of, you can see this. When they're really young, they don't have much going on. They just look kind of like a weird anemone. As they get bigger, they start to get this little stack of jelly clones. And once they're big enough, they start to pop off, which looks like it's almost about to happen with this one here and that one over there. And they pop off and they float around, and then over time they gradually grow into that full big jelly. And this is the part of how their life works that is the most confusing and weird of all. That big jelly, the adult version that we were looking at earlier, right? The one these will eventually grow into, that thing doesn't live very long. That thing maybe lives a few months, a few years if it's super lucky, right? Because eventually it gets in trouble somehow, gets eaten or whatever. These things, because they're in a pretty safe place, and because jellies don't really age, and because they reproduce through cloning at this point, these things can live for decades. So this tiny little jelly cloning machine here on this rock might sit here 10, 15 years, maybe more, just making jelly clones as long as it's getting food. Whereas when it finally produces that big, beautiful adult jelly, that thing doesn't get to live that long. So jellies have a really complex, really weird life cycle that is really mysterious, and we're still learning more about it all the time. Got a couple more questions for our last few minutes here. Miss Mizzle's class asked, can they sting each other? That is a good question. I believe the answer is yes, but I think it has some qualifiers. I don't know if I know this one off the top of my head, though. They can certainly get tangled up with each other. We've seen that before. Do they sting each other? Yeah, I think they might be immune to each other's sting, but there's certainly jellies that can eat other jellies. I don't know a lot about this. I don't know. Yeah, okay, that's an interesting piece of feedback. So Stewie just gave me some more information on this. So, from what we know, and we're always learning on this show ourselves, jellies are generally not able to sting their own species, which makes sense, right? Because they're all swimming together all the time. But they can't eat other species of jelly. Sometimes. It depends on the jelly. Because remember, some jellies have really, really powerful stinging abilities, really, really powerful stinging cells, really powerful venom. Others less so. Like the moon jelly, you can touch them anywhere on their body and it won't even hurt you. Whereas these, if you were to touch those stinging tentacles, you would find yourself very, very, very uncomfortable a few minutes later. Got another question that's important to answer about jellies. How many species of jellies are there? And this is a great one. Today, we know about 2,000 jelly species that have actually been described. But the thing is, there's lots of them that we haven't discovered yet. In fact, I was reading a story like 2 days ago about a new jelly species that was discovered in the deep ocean. So we're constantly discovering new jellies. They're one of those things that we still are learning a lot about. And here's another crazy thing about them. Jellies are one of the most ancient groups of animals on the planet. Jellyfish were one of the first things that was big enough really to see, that was big enough to have complex organs and stuff, to evolve. The early ocean, the very, very, very early ocean, we're talking hundreds of millions of years ago, in fact, over 500 million years ago, would have been dominated by predators that basically were just jellies. They were functioning like jellies. The organisms hadn't figured out how to do things like, make things like fins and stuff yet. Basically, the earliest animals that were able to kind of function as predators on a larger scale and had things like, a digestive system and a reproductive system that were separate and stuff like that, were jellies and their ancestors. So jellies, there's a couple thousand species that we know of living today. We also know there's thousands more that we haven't probably found yet. And there's got to be thousands, maybe tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of species that have already gone extinct in the past, because jellies have been around for hundreds of millions of years. But they're really hard to study in the past, though, because, well, they're jellies, aren't they? They don't leave very good fossils, not bones and stuff like dinosaurs do. So jellies are probably the most famous and spectacular of all the different kinds of plankton in the world. And there are actually big distinctions between different kinds of jellies. Most of the jellies I've been talking about so far today are animals that we call cnidarians. They're relatives of things like anemones and corals and stuff. But there's also other branches of, or there's other entire groups of jellies that are totally different. For example, there's groups called, they're very, very similar looking animals called ctenophores, which have a very similar lifestyle. They're sometimes called glass jellies and comb jellies and stuff like that. This is a flower hat jelly here. We can get a ctenophore up here, can't we? And an easy way to know if you're looking at a jelly like this one or at a ctenophore is to look for these little things. If you see a thing that you think might be a jelly, but you see these flashy little stripy things going on, these little iridescent stripes, that's how you know you're looking at a ctenophore. Jellies move by pumping, but the ctenophores, they move by undulating these teeny tiny little fin-like things. And it almost looks like they've got a light show going on, because as these little frilly things move, they reflect different colors of light. So it creates a really cool kind of like strobe party light effect. So that's another group of jelly-like animals, but actually they're not exactly jellies. And there's a few other weird jelly-like animals too. There's things called salps, which basically look like a floating bag. Another reason why you want to make sure not to have any plastic bags throw up in the ocean. There's this thing, I don't even know what this is. What is this, Chewy? Oh, it's a by-the-wind sea otter. So this is another example of one of those, again, jelly-like organisms. This one's not floating at the moment, so it's a little hard to tell, but this sitting on a piece of seaweed. These sometimes wash up on beaches and people get real confused by them. This is a gelatinous organism that just blows around on the surface of the ocean because it has this little fan that sticks out at the top, just floats around. And another kind of plankton. So jellyfish, when we talk about them, mostly we're talking about, things like the sea nettles and stuff like that, but a lot of the things that you see in the ocean that are gelatinous aren't necessarily jellies. There's actually a lot of other kinds of jelly-like organisms out there too. In fact, one of the most famous gelatinous organisms in the ocean, the Portuguese man-of-war, not actually a jelly. So it's a siphonophore, isn't it? If I remember correctly. Anyway, don't quote me on that. So anyway, my point is, there is so much that you can learn about plankton and about jellies, and you will never run out of things to learn. If you're interested in learning about jellies and studying jellies and being a jelly scientist, well, guess what? There's a lot of great work left to do. Jellies are being learned about, and we're discovering more about them all the time. It's a really, really great area to study and explore, because even though they seem so simple, they're surprisingly complicated. And they have a lot of amazing ways they've managed to keep functioning in the ocean for all these millions and millions and hundreds of millions of years. So I hope everybody's enjoyed our class today. Remember, if you have any questions, you can email us also at live@lbaop.org. Other than that, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye, everybody. Oh, wait. Okay, wait, don't sign off yet. I forgot. Teachers, if you're joining us today, if you could let us know how many students are in your class watching, we would be really interested to know. It helps us to know how our program is spreading and how many viewers we've got. And so if you want to share with us how many students you've got in your class watching, you can just text us at our text number before signing off, and we'll really appreciate it. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.